Welcome back everyone to another episode of The Road Chose Me. My name's Dan, and on today's episode, let's talk about why the Jeep camper is built on a Jeep Wrangler and not a Jeep Gladiator. It is by far and away the most common question I'm getting. And this is Michael's camper. This is the first prototype ever built. Mine is sitting just over there and the build is continuing. We've made a lot of progress, which I'll show you next week. But what I decided for this week was to answer this most commonly asked question. So if you're wondering, what are the pros and cons? What are the reasons that we've gone with a Wrangler instead of the Gladiator, which on paper seems like a better option? Then grab a comfortable seat, grab something to drink. This is a fairly in-depth topic. I'm gonna have lots of renderings on the screen, lots of hand waving, lots of theory and design topics that in the end, I think you'll agree with me, but I am interested to hear your thoughts. Is the Wrangler better than the Gladiator for what we're doing, building a living camper? So let's get into all of the details right now. Before we get too far into the discussion topic, I want to make sure that everyone is on the same page and that we all understand what I'm talking about here. So sitting behind me, this was originally a four-door Jeep Wrangler. Jeep usually call it the Unlimited. That just refers to the four-door version. And just for completeness sake, the wheelbase on this thing was 118 inches and the overall length was 188 inches. That is the base vehicle. What a lot of people are asking me about is why I didn't use a Jeep Gladiator. And so a Jeep Gladiator, it's the new kid on the block. It's Jeep's take on a pickup truck. Although Jeep probably wouldn't want me to say it, basically, from the rear doors forward, it is a Jeep Wrangler in every possible way. It has exactly the same drivetrain options. It has exactly the same engine, wheels, all of that stuff. The only difference is behind the rear doors, they basically closed out the cab and they added a 5-foot bed to turn it into a pickup truck. They also did extend the wheelbase. So on the Gladiator, the wheelbase is 137 inches and the overall length of the vehicle is 218 inches. So anyway, Wrangler v Gladiator, you can see right there on the screen, the biggest difference is that the wheelbase has been stretched by 19 inches. So it is a significantly longer vehicle. Overall, the vehicle is 30 inches longer. What does that mean? Where did the other 10 inches go or come from? Basically, that's how much longer the Gladiator overhangs the rear axle by. So it overhangs the rear axle by a significant amount and the wheelbase is longer. So that is what we're talking about when we say, what about Jeep Wrangler or what about Jeep Gladiator? And so when it comes to building a camper, the obvious or the easy thing to do is to choose a Jeep Gladiator. And there's quite a few reasons for that. And right off the bat, a Gladiator, it has a higher payload, which is obviously ideal for overlanding. From my point of view, it has more space under the frame, so you can have more fuel tanks, more water tanks, and you can mount those underneath, which means they're not impinging on your living area or your seating compartment, which is really, really nice. And probably I think the main reason that people are asking me about it is because the bed of the Jeep Gladiator, it's just bolted onto the frame. Two people can unbolt it and carry it away, and then you just have a bare frame to work with. And you can build a box right there, some sort of living box like the one behind me. Obviously that seems like a really easy thing to do and it looks on paper to be a better idea. Before I get into the actual specifics of that, I do also want to mention that while the Gladiator has all those advantages, it does also have disadvantages that I think people don't talk about all that much. Because it's new, because it's cool, people just immediately think Gladiator is better than Wrangler. And from my experience, I'm gonna say that's not quite true. So for me, I drove my four-door Jeep Wrangler 54,000 miles around Africa. I've driven it nearly that far again around North America. So I've got a lot of experience with the four-door Wrangler. And then in Australia, I had the Jeep Gladiator and I drove that 36,000 miles all the way around Australia. I drove all the tough tracks, all the remote desert crossings and all of that. So I think it's safe to say I've got a lot of experience with both the Wrangler and the Gladiator. And from my point of view, there are a few downsides. First of all, without a question, the Gladiator is more expensive. So up front, you will be dropping more money to get into this vehicle. From my point of view, if you're gonna cut half of it and throw half of it away, that's scary to do it with more money. I'd rather do it with the least amount of money possible. So price was my first factor. The second one is that the Gladiator clearly has a worse breakover angle. And so because the wheelbase is so much longer, it's much more inclined to scrape the belly on obstacles when you're off-roading. And I didn't really know how big of a deal this was going to be until the very first time I took mine off-roading in Australia and I scraped the belly. And so I drove my Jeep around Africa, I've driven up to the Arctic Circle many times. My Wrangler never ever scraped the belly once. The very first time I off-roaded the Gladiator, I scraped the belly. So yeah, it is definitely a thing. As well as that, it has a longer rear overhang. And there definitely were some shelf obstacles in the Victorian High Country up on Cape York, the old telly track. I banged up that rear, dropping down into obstacles. That rear overhang on the Wrangler is almost non-existent. So again, that was a downside of the Gladiator. And then for me too, the Gladiator is a tricky vehicle because it has the back seat and all that area in the cabin. I filled it up with batteries and some storage, but it wasn't really necessary. I always wished that that was living space, not just kind of like systems storage space. So I wanted to get those out of the way. The Gladiator does actually have some downsides compared to the Wrangler, but if we were going to build a camper on the back of a Gladiator, let's have a look at what is the first and maybe the most obvious and easiest option, throwing a box on the back in place of the rear bed. So it's really great. We have a real example of this being done. Phil from Down to Mob Overland, he built a box that went on the back of his Gladiator, and he just had this thing at Overland Expo West. I checked it out, and I think it's a really good example of what that ends up looking like. Basically, you pull off the rear bed, you bolt on a box, and that's it, you're good to go. I think it's a really good option, and I'm really happy that Phil built it because we can all learn from it. But for me, and I think for Michael, who designed what's sitting behind me, it doesn't actually meet our needs, and it's not what we want. And there's a few reasons for that. And the first reason is the bed of the Gladiator is only 5 feet long. So if you build a living box that is that length, you've only got a 5-foot living area. That's pretty tiny. That's not really big enough. You can't sleep in it lengthwise. It's going to be about 6 feet wide. That's how wide this is. That's how wide Phil's is. It's just a little bit narrower than the mirrors. So you're not going to make it any wider, and you've only got 5 feet in length. Let's say you even extend the rear overhang even more, even though it's already significant in the Gladiator. Give yourself an extra foot. Now you're at 6 feet. Now you have a bit of a departure cut. Maybe now you're at 6.5 feet. I think that's reasonably as long as you can go. And you're going to have to be very careful not to put too much weight behind the rear axle. That's all you get for a living box. Maybe that's big enough. The strange thing is, sitting here behind me, this thing is 7.5 feet long in the living box. That's right, the box behind me is 1.5 feet longer than you could realistically put on a Jeep Gladiator. So right off the bat, this gets more living space than a box on the back of a Jeep Gladiator. So I find that really fascinating as reason number one that I don't really want that option. The second reason that I'm not too excited about the Jeep Gladiator version is because of the back seat and because of how much space that takes up. So on paper, you could transport 4 people, maybe even 5 people in Phil's box on the back of a Gladiator camper, which is great on paper, but the reality is you only have a living box that's 6.5 feet long. Where are those 4 people going to sleep? They're not going to sleep and eat and cook and live inside of that box. It's simply not big enough. And then it actually turns out, when you look at Phil's build, he threw out his back seat. He has his fridge, his water tank, his batteries, all of his solar setup. All of that occupies all of that previously rear seat space. So although the vehicle on paper transports 4 or 5 people, it actually doesn't in reality, and it has a small living box on the back. So again, I actually prefer this version because the box is bigger, all of the living systems are already in it, so you don't waste the whole back seat, those extra doors. You basically just have more wheelbase and more vehicle, but you don't get any benefits. You're not transporting more people, and you don't have bigger living space. So that actually fundamentally is why this is not just a box on the back of a Gladiator. There is, of course, more options for how you could put a box on the back of a Gladiator. And these start to just get more and more complicated and more expensive, but I do think they're worth talking about. And I think the first and most obvious option is that you chop the Gladiator and you turn it into a two-door vehicle. Then you maybe have like an 8 feet bed to work with, and then you could put a box on the back that is 8 feet long. And yes, I think that would be a dream. Yes, I think that would be incredible. Lots of you are about to tell me that Jeep actually made a two-door Gladiator. Here it is on the screen, the J6 they called it. I actually crawled all over it with a tape measure inside and out when I saw it at Toledo Jeep Fest a few years ago. A couple of things about this vehicle: it's not a Jeep Gladiator at all. It's actually a 4-door Jeep Wrangler. It has the same wheelbase as what's sitting behind me. It does not have a particularly long bed, less than 7.5 feet, which is how long our camper box is. So it's not a Gladiator at all. But let's just go hypothetical. Let's pretend we took a Jeep Gladiator. Let's pretend we cut it off right behind the front doors. We move the rear of the hardtop so it closes out right behind those doors. Yes, then we have a huge amount of space to build a box. I like the idea. It is extremely expensive, and I'm hand waving away all of the details. I have no experience with sheet metal, which would require a lot of sheet metal to bond the rear back on behind the driver's door. It turns out there's a ton of electronics right behind the back seat in the Gladiator. There's a whole bunch of CAN stuff and a whole bunch of computers. All of those would have to get moved forward. I don't even know if you would shorten the wiring looms or if you would just coil them all up and hope for the best. But that gets really complicated. You have to modify the hardtop, which means fiberglass. Do you cut it and join it? I don't know if that's strong enough. The freedom panels kind of get in the way. All of that starts to get complicated. If I had an unlimited budget, would I be interested in that? Who knows, maybe. That is kind of another way that you could do it, but it is way outside my budget, and I don't really think that it necessarily is better than what's behind me, but we're gonna touch on that again in a minute. So I think that's option number 2 for how you could use a Gladiator. And then option number 3, which I think is also valid, is that you do what we've done. You cut it off behind the rear doors, but then you bond the rear box straight on to the back of the rear doors. So you don't have to modify the hardtop, you don't have to close out all the sheet metal. Basically then you get a pass through just like we have, and you can climb from the driver's seat straight back into the living box. Again, you would have a huge living box. That thing must be nearly 9 feet long, tons of space in there. I think that would be incredible. But there's one huge problem with that, and that is that the box and the cabin of the Gladiator were designed to move independently. So they can twist, they can crunch, they can do all of those things, and that's okay, that's how it was designed. If you lock them together like this in a rigid fashion, you're going to have problems. Nobody really knows how much that frame needs to twist. Part of it too is the on-road manners will change if you make it rigid, but then if you go off-roading, are you basically just going to tear the box off the cab and tear your brand new camper vehicle in half? It is a very real possibility. Nobody actually knows the answer because nobody's done it yet. And the reason, if you're wondering, that it's hopefully not going to be a problem on this vehicle is because the camper box on this is basically just replacing the original Jeep sheet metal. So originally this was one big rigid structure. You know, the front doors can't move separately to the rear tailgate. It was steel solid bolted onto the top of the frame. And obviously the whole unit moves and the frame is underneath it. We've just done the same thing. Our whole box is bonded rigidly to the roll bar, to the forward cabin in many places, so that this is just an extension of the forward cabin. Essentially, up on top of the frame is still one big rigid unit, and it is bolted onto the frame just like the factory body was. So the unit on top will move around and the frame will move around, and that is perfectly okay. On the Gladiator though, they are not supposed to be together, and as I said, nobody's really sure what would happen if you actually did that. So I think those are kind of the valid or the ways that you could build something like this on a Jeep Gladiator. And would it be really cool to see that? Absolutely. If you're all about it, I'd love to see you build it. Please send me a link. But there is another fundamental reason why this is not a Jeep Gladiator. And this one's a bit more philosophical rather than technical. And it actually comes down to Michael Fuchs, who designed and built this thing, and his partner Yvonne, and kind of their experience. And so they've been traveling and overlanding for a long time. They explored a lot in a two-door Jeep Wrangler with a rooftop tent. They really loved it, but they kind of got sick of being in the snow and stuff in a rooftop tent. And so they said, why don't we build a live-in camper? And so they built something on an LMTV, they had a Pinzengauer, and they ended up building out a really, really sweet Unimog. And this thing, I think, is a dream vehicle for a lot of people. They took it all the way up to the Arctic Circle, all the way back, many, many adventures. But what I find really fascinating is at the end of all of that, they said, this vehicle is so, so big that it is actually subtracting from the adventure. If they ever got it stuck, there would literally be no one to pull them out. It weighs 14,000 pounds. It got about 13 miles a gallon. So it's like a $300 fill up every time you need to buy gas. And that's a long way when you drive to the Arctic Circle and back. So they spent a lot of money on gas. And so the vehicle was so big, they couldn't go on tight trails. They weren't willing to sort of go places where a nimble little Jeep would be able to go. So when they got home, they said to each other, we really loved having the live inside ability. We could get out of the mosquitoes and get out of the rain. We loved our hot diesel heater. We loved having running water and a fridge. They said, but what if you could have all of those benefits, but have it on a smaller vehicle? And they started to investigate and they started to research. And that actually is how Michael came up with this prototype. He said, yeah, a Unimog's great and it's huge, but I don't necessarily believe that bigger is better. I actually want all of the benefits that the Unimog brought, but on a much smaller frame and a much smaller vehicle so that it's more enjoyable to drive, it gets better mileage, it goes on tighter trails, just all around it's a bit more enjoyable to live with. And so then that kind of extends into why isn't it a Jeep Gladiator? Because a Jeep Gladiator is just an extension of that idea of bigger is better. But Michael, from the very get-go, decided to go for smaller. And the reality is, we don't actually know if this is too small. We don't know. Maybe we'll take it, we'll live in it full time for 6 months or a year, and then we'll say, yeah, it'd be really good if it was like 3 feet longer. Let's find out. There's kind of only one way to know. Dave Harriton, of course, built the Outpost 2, obviously fairly significant vehicle that is very similar in concept to this. He loves it. He said it is plenty big enough. He's taken it many, many places. So I think there's a funny breakover point there of like, you need it to be a certain size, you can sleep in it, you can stand up, you can cook, but I don't necessarily think that making it ginormously bigger is really an advantage. And then it was funny, Michael and I were just looking at the numbers, the overall length of the Gladiator and the overall length of his Unimog. Let's hypothetically say you put a box on the back of a Gladiator, a lot like Phil from Down the Mob. Let's say you made it a 6.5 foot bed, so you've extended the Gladiator 1.5 foot longer than it ever was. It actually turns out now your Gladiator is about 1 foot shorter than Michael's Unimog was. So you now have a Jeep Gladiator that is as long as a Unimog. That is a really, really big vehicle. That is going to be challenging on tight trails. That rear overhang, you are going to know about it. All of the problems of a big vehicle you now have, but you kind of don't have the benefits of the Unimog. You don't have the ground clearance. You don't have the massive cabin on the back that is so big you can sleep many, many people, all of that stuff. So I think it's a really interesting discussion there about like, bigger is not necessarily better, but how big is big enough? That is what we're trying to find out. And to be honest, that is why it is built on a Jeep Wrangler. So there you go, guys. Thanks for sticking with me. That is a very big topic with lots and lots to consider. But as you can see, for what we're doing, the Gladiator is not immediately a better choice. And actually, I do feel quite strongly that the Wrangler is a better choice for what we're doing. I am really interested though to hear your input and your thoughts. And in general, if you have more questions about the camper, about the whys, about the whats, please do throw them in the comments down below and I will get to them either in the comments or I'll film videos like this one in the future. I feel like a big part of what I do is I want to help educate people out there, show people what works, show people what I'm doing and why I'm doing it so that they can apply that to their own situation. Because after all, I think the vehicle is going to be great for me and Katie and for Michael and his wife Yvonne, but is it great for you? Well, that depends on you. That depends on the size of your family. That depends on where you want to take it. It is not a one-size-fits-all thing. So work on building the vehicle that works for you. Don't just copy what someone else did. So that's the end of the video. Thanks again for watching. Thanks for sticking with me. Thanks to also my supporters on Patreon who make this all possible. They're getting behind the scenes content, updates on my build, how it's going, our trials and tribulations. And I am still pushing hard to get it to Overland Expo Pacific Northwest. That is July 7 to July 9 in Redmond, Oregon. I'll be there. The new vehicle is, I think, going to be there. So hopefully I'll see you there. And until then, have fun out there, and maybe I'll bump into you on the road.